This is the SBB Giruno from Swiss train manufacturer Stadler that holds around 403 people and can travel at speeds up to 250 km per hour. And this is the Gotthard base tunnel that is designed for speeds up to 250 km per hour. Despite the Giruno frequently travelling through the Gotthard base tunnel, it will never hit speeds of 250 km per hour inside this tunnel. In fact, you won't ever see this train go faster than 200 km per hour anywhere else in Switzerland. Even though Switzerland has no problem designing trains and tracks to meet the definition of high-speed rail, Switzerland does not and is not intending to have high-speed rail. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we get into it, we need to do some boring definitions of what actually is high-speed rail. Well, high-speed rail is defined by the International Union of Railways as speeds on new tracks above 250 km per hour, or existing tracks with operating speeds with a minimum of 200 km per hour. But these definitions have caveats of their own, and the International Union of Railways says that there are also multiple definitions for high-speed rail. For our purposes, we're going to use the definition of minimum 250 km per hour on whichever track, and we'll say very high-speed rail for 350 km per hour plus speeds. So why doesn't Switzerland have high-speed rail? Well, it's because it's not worth it. Every choice in life has a brief cost-benefit assessment to see whether what you're doing is worth the input costs. Whether you're deciding if waking up and going to work is worth the return of the bus ticket or opportunity cost of not going to work, or if you can manage to convince your wife the AMG package of the Mercedes Vito is necessary to shuffle the kids around for the morning school run. Every decision has a cost-benefit analysis, and that also applies to high-speed rail in Switzerland. When it comes to high-speed rail, there are two necessary components that make up this centuries-old invention, flying down a rail with the contact patch of a small coin, of speeds of over 250 km per hour. That would be the rolling stock and the tracks. The rolling stock is the easy part, as you have multiple suppliers across the world that can sell you a train set to blast 300 km per hour down a track. High-speed rail tracks, on the other hand, are site-specific. You cannot dismantle the Tokyo to Osaka high-speed rail track and plonk it in the middle of Switzerland. High-speed tracks are expensive, not just because of the required technology, but also because of the alignments required to foster high speeds. That necessitates bridges, tunnels, or lots of earthworks, because history is full of overzealous train engineers finding out the hard way that a vehicle with the wheelbase width of your average family car and a center of gravity of an AT-AT Walker and Hoff does not corner well at high speeds. To not have a repeat of these types of accidents, your tracks need to be designed and constructed correctly. Train tracks are generally designed to a specific use case, with the most expensive, of course, being the higher speed rails, and the cheapest being, well, whatever this thing is. In order to facilitate high speeds, and of course safety, the tracks need to minimize gradients, curve radii, implement technology to prevent fast trains banging into each other, because whilst low friction steel on steel is great for speed, it isn't great for stopping, resulting in long brake distances. And finally, the track needs to be constructed to very tight tolerances, because if not, a centimetre out of alignment could derail your train at high speeds. If tolerances aren't met, then speeds have to drop to maintain safety. Whilst we may be laughing at this bumpy track, the train still manages to get through because its non-next day Amazon delivery speed matches the design tolerance spec of Friday 4:59 PM job. Now, in order to hit these tolerances, dropping a bunch of sleepers onto the ground, then eyeballing the alignment of the rails doesn't quite cut it anymore, like it did in the 19th century. You need a lot of technology and specialized construction equipment to make sure the minimum tolerances are achieved, and that means, of course, a much higher cost. Tolerances aside, to go fast on rails, they need to be straight first and foremost. Now, whilst building straight tracks isn't so much of an issue in most other large countries, Switzerland has chosen hard mode on the terrain and spawned in with mountainous terrain covering just over 2/3 of its landmass. The remaining third of the country's land predominantly runs east-west across the country known as the Mittelland or Swiss Plateau, where the land is mostly flat. However, even here, the landscape is blessed with an undulating hills that interrupt the straight and flat terrain. During the 19th century railway boom that occurred in Europe and in this case also in Switzerland, railways were built to first and foremost connect the existing towns and avoid difficult terrain such as mountains, and not so much designing for straight lines to facilitate high-speed trains. Even though this thing could hit some neck-breaking speeds of 40 km an hour, it still wasn't enough to fly off the tracks. These track alignments served their purpose for decades, until the post-war boom years when railway operators around the world were spurred on to develop a faster product to counter increasing air travel and the rise of the private car. It all began with the Shinkansen in the 1960s, which at the time operated at an impressive 160 km per hour. In the following decades, European countries like Italy, France, and Germany, driven by the tradition of precision engineering, followed suit, developing increasingly faster trains. The Swiss, on the other hand, floated the idea of a rapid, high-speed railway connection, primarily between the cities of Zurich and Bern, with top speeds of 200 kilometers per hour, that would bring travel times between the two large cities down to 45 minutes. Some of you might scoff at 200 kilometer per hour speeds, but such speeds proposed in the 1940s was quite groundbreaking. These plans, originally thought up in the 1940s by visionary engineers and planners, probably seemed quite delusional at the time, but their predictions were pretty on the money. However, they unfortunately didn't live long enough to see their plans of 200 km per hour trains in Switzerland that only materialized around the year 2000. Along with the high-speed rail idea, the visionaries in the 1940s were also quite accurate with other ideas that seemed quite familiar today, such as phone calls from the train, climate-controlled wagons, and a tunnel to conquer the Alps. These ideas didn't immediately manifest themselves, primarily because these ideas were written up by some theoretical engineers and planners, and it wasn't rooted in SBB official policy. But also in the 50s and 60s, a lot of public funds were eaten up by the roads boom that left little for SBB expansion plans. The consequences of which became quite apparent with dwindling ridership numbers in the 60s, of course partially due to the rise in car ownership. That lit a flame under the arse of SBB to commission a report to find out how they could lure back its passengers and the ridership. The massive investigation and report suggested building a dense, high-frequency, relatively high-speed east-west axis stretching from St. Gallen in the east to Geneva in the west. The plan was reviewed by officials at all levels of government, and it didn't win many fans. Critics argued it was too limited in scope, serving mainly the larger cities along the already well-connected Swiss plateau rail corridors. Meanwhile, towns and cities outside the main route like Solothurn and Neuchâtel, both important economic hubs, would be left without fast connections. And if even those key centres were being overlooked, imagine how the more remote or peripheral regions felt. Poor Ticino. A government transport committee reviewed the plan after rural regions spoke out about their transport connections being neglected, all whilst a few cities get well-subsidised connections. It didn't take a genius to figure out that such a proposal would surely get smacked down by a referendum by the people. So the transport committees went back to the drawing boards with a new objective of creating more buy-in from the whole country by improving everyone's rail network. And in 1986, a new report with multiple recommendations and plans titled Bahn 2000 was released. Bahn 2000 was designed to improve the whole of Switzerland's rail network, particularly speed and frequency of trains across its whole network that includes the smaller towns and cities with feeder connections, not just select high traffic routes. Now, before anyone from an underserved part of Switzerland jumps in, let me clarify. Bahn 2000 wasn't about giving every region exactly the same level of service, rather it aimed to prevent the gap in service quality from becoming too wide. In order to facilitate this, existing lines had to be expanded in some areas and some routes were straightened out or sections bypassed altogether with new bridges and tunnels. New rolling stock was introduced, including double-decker trains known as the IC2000, and stations were extended to accommodate the larger trains, significantly boosting passenger capacity per train. If you're ever in Switzerland and about to go on a long-distance train trip, I highly recommend you try and take the IC2000 wagons. It is vastly superior in everything than the newer rolling hot mess of the FV Dosto. I'll cover that thing in another video. Apart from numerous new tunnels and connecting tracks, the most notable additions were the tunnels punching through the Alps, particularly the 57-kilometer-long Gotthard Base Tunnel, and finally, the Rothiers to Mattstetten line. This line was borrowed from the plan drawn up in the 50s to have fast and frequent trains between Zurich and Bern within 45 minutes, but only a partial section was built compared with the plan in the 50s. But even though billions were set aside by the federal government to realise this plan, it still wasn't enough to cover the required projects, and some had to be cut or delayed. From shovel start in the mid-80s, it was becoming readily apparent that costs weren't what they originally calculated, and in order to make sure existing projects were properly funded to completion, parts of the Bahn 2000 project had to be delayed but ready to be implemented at a later date. Now, why am I telling you the modern development history of Swiss train network? Well, it's because it provides valuable context as to how the Swiss analysed the cost benefits of high-speed rail, and how they place greater importance on performance of the whole network rather than the speed of select routes. To this day, they are still undertaking projects first outlined in the Bahn 2000 report. It has cost billions, all to simply facilitate trains to travel at a maximum of only 200 km per hour. Whilst not all lines get 200 km per hour routes, 200 km was a happy medium that met both the budgetary constraints of the network strategy project, whilst at the same time achieving reasonable frequency and travel times. No one could argue that the modern stretches of tracks such as the Gotthard and Rothiers Mattstetten line have the proper alignment and tolerances to facilitate high-speed rail, so why not just redline a few trains to save some time? And this is a fair question. Why not get the Stadler Girona and the Italian-designed and built ETR 600 to fly at speeds of 250 km per per hour or more to get passengers where they want to go quicker. Well, those time savings honestly aren't that great for the existing tracks. With the longest high-speed rail section being 57km long Gotthard Tunnel, if you were to account for acceleration up to 300km per hour and deceleration to around 80km per hour, the savings versus travelling at a top speed of 200km per hour is about 5 to 6 minutes between those distances. 5 to 6 minutes is a respectable travel time saving in some contexts, but these speed increases disrupt other strategies that SBB relies on to maintain the high level of service that was envisioned in the Bahn 2000 report. And one of the strategies SBB employs to minimize faster transfer times and enable swift connections, ultimately shortening overall travel durations, is the Taktfahrplan. The English translation of Taktfahrplan is clock face scheduling, or regular interval timetabling. While this translation is technically accurate, the concept carries a deeper significance in the Swiss context. Clock face scheduling refers to a system where trains, or other public transport, arrive and depart at consistent, constant repeating intervals, typically at the same minute past each hour, throughout the day. This creates a predictable and easily understandable timetable for passengers who only need to remember the minute of the departure rather than checking schedules for every hour. However, this only partially captures what the Taktfahrplan really is. What often gets left out of the generic explanations of clock face scheduling is that the Taktfahrplan goes a step further. It aligns and synchronizes arrival and departure times at key stations across the network. This coordination ensures the majority intercity connections arrive at the same time in key stations, making passenger transfers smooth and efficient. For example, trains from Bern, Zurich, and Basel would all arrive in Olten around the same time. So if you were traveling on the Bern-Zurich train, but you need to go to Basel, you can hop off in Olten and straight into the waiting Zurich to Basel train. This prevents long transfer times because your connecting train left 2 minutes before your train arrived at the station, forcing you to wait longer. Transfer times are the bane of positive public transport perception, as people would rather sit in a slow travelling train than sitting at the station doing nothing. Not only does it allow seamless transfers between the intercity services, local and regional trains would be timed to arrive before these major connection times, further contributing to the connectivity factor. As an example of how this timetabling is visualized, let's widen our scope and look at other parts of the network, and we start to notice a clear, consistent pattern emerging. No matter which route you take from Basel to Lausanne, the total travel time always adds up to exactly 135 minutes. In other words, the entire system is somewhat perfectly in sync. Now, if you were to make any of these routes faster by about 6 minutes with high-speed rail, you run the risk of destabilizing this integration. Okay, yes, a train can arrive earlier and just wait longer so people can get to their destination faster. Seems like there's no harm in that, but that train is now occupying a station slot for an extra 6 minutes waiting for other trains. Unfortunately, trains aren't exactly a pocketable item you can stash in the corner. They're large, hulking pieces of Chad-level transport. So that 6-minute window waiting takes up a platform in an otherwise often space-constrained station that other trains can use, because the Taktfahrplan isn't just for intercity trains, it's also for other trains such as interregional, regional, and Stadtbahns. Whilst yes, the trains are punctual and arrive early, having them arrive too early just creates more problems than it solves regarding station capacity. Though that doesn't mean SBB places no importance on speed, because SBB has been constructing non-stop over the decades to increase the amount of stations that are incorporated into this Taktfahrplan, as well as increasing speeds across the whole network to bring some track section travel times down to just under an hour, such as the Fribourg-Lausanne section, mainly done through improved rolling stock. And we all know how that went. Looking at you, FV Dosto. Most of these sections are slow going because their track alignments haven't changed since they were first laid down decades ago. But SBB has numerous plans to duplicate single tracks and straighten alignments elsewhere across the network. And once they've completed that, then high-speed rail still isn't on the menu. The increase in capacity and speed of trains isn't just for distant trains that can travel high speeds, but also for local trains. These slower, frequently stopping local and regional trains are another constraint on the shared tracks that higher speed trains share. Rail planners have to account for these slower trains on the network and restrict top speeds of the faster distance trains to avoid having incidents akin to that BMW driver that's constantly up your arse on the highway because he needs to rush home and kiss his dad on the lips. The logical way that other countries who had the same problem solve this constrained track problem is to separate the high-speed tracks from the slower trains. Not only is this a massive cost implication to provision nearly all rail corridors with 4 tracks to facilitate high speed, it's really not the priority for SBB and its somewhat limited resources. SBB has shown that before any major performance upgrades are made, the whole network needs to hit a minimum standard across the board. Because just like your favorite football team, performance is judged on overall consistency, not individual stars. As Norway painfully learns every World Cup qualifiers, having the Premier League's top striker doesn't guarantee you a spot in the tournament. Now, I'm fully aware that Norway can't go out and buy players, but you get the picture. Improving overall performance is more than spending your whole team budget on one top player. Applying this analogy to trains in Switzerland, SBB is famous for its high service quality and reliability because it prioritized the basics, not because it prioritized speed. To showcase an opposite example of if you were to actually dump your money into limited high performance projects and neglect the rest of your network, we are going to take a look at Germany. Everyone outside of Europe thinks their high-speed trains are amazing, and we should totally emulate what they do, such as high-speed trains and strong beer culture. But within Germany, their rail network is a bit of a laughingstock. Constantly delayed trains, cancellations, and beautiful high-speed rolling stock forced to crawl through congested urban railways are just a few examples of the failing national railway. Deutsche Bahn has gotten so bad that the national railway operator effectively told its passengers that the timetables are merely guides and not to be trusted, which is presumably a very bold tactic of managing public relations. Delays in Germany have gotten so bad that its rail reliability is now lower than that of the UK. It's already humbling to be outperformed by their perpetual arch-nemesis, the French, but slipping below the UK, where iconic rail innovations include slapping a bus chassis on a train and charging the price of a flight to Spain, and a country where buses cosplay as trains more than actual trains cosplay as trains, is a solid kick in the shins from the once proud national railway operator. Okay, not that far back. It's a bigger hit to the image of the German precision engineering ego than getting knocked out in the World Cup group stage twice in a row. It's clear something had to change. Deutsche Bahn is now scrambling and throwing billions at fixing capacity constraints and upgrading its aging infrastructure. But even though it has high-speed rail, not a lot of its network is capable of letting trains achieve the top speeds foreigners always fawn about. Most of the network runs below 250 km per hour, but even this speed is wishful thinking, as these lines are often overloaded with all types of trains, forcing modern 300 km per hour capable trains down to the generic speeds of the basic bitch S-Bahn. Deutsche Bahn expects the delays and disruptions to continue for another 10 years until crucial capacity alleviating projects, such as the infamously delayed Stuttgart Hauptbahnhof, is completed before improvements in the network are manifested. Germany serves as a living example of what happens when you prioritize the right infrastructure at the wrong time. So in order to avoid such catastrophes and make sure a referendum doesn't shut the funding tap off to grand projects because a rural vote was left out, the federal government and SBB had chosen to focus on capacity and reliability. Because whilst the near 400-kilometer trip from St. Gallen in the east to Geneva in the west may be slightly faster with the car, nothing pisses people off more than the uncertainty of delays. SBB is renowned for delivering exactly what it promises, boasting the highest reliability and punctuality rates in Europe. This is achieved while operating one of the most intensely used rail networks on the continent, fitting for a country where train travel per capita is the highest in Europe. This kind of reliability plays a huge role in shifting travel habits towards rail, because when the timetable says 4 hours by train, it actually means 4 hours in reality. In contrast, driving can feel like a gamble, with unpredictable delays from traffic, especially on long weekends or when passing through the Gotthard Tunnel, where even a nearby sneeze seems to be enough to trigger a 20-kilometer traffic jam. No thanks, I'd rather delete a 6-pack of beers on the train. Now, I've just gone into detail explaining why track speeds above 200 km an hour aren't really worth it in Switzerland, but I'm trying to highlight the focus here on overall network performance, which takes priority when it comes to funding. Building fully separated high-speed lines would be too costly, and a piecemeal high-speed track implementation tend to disrupt the existing network more than they help, all for just a few minutes of time saved. But then the question comes, will Switzerland ever get high-speed rail once all these projects duplicating and aligning tracks are complete? The shorter answer is, we don't know. Whilst most of the projects outlined in the Bahn 2000 report have been complete, SBB keeps adding incremental infrastructure upgrades to decrease Taktfahrplan travel times and increase the amount of key stations integrated into this plan. Mixed into these incremental upgrades are also some hefty large pieces of crucial infrastructure that improves network performance across difficult terrain such as a mountain range. But there are also some other projects that separate faster trains from slower local trains in order to improve travel times as well. One of these is the Zurich to Aargau tunnel that would link up with the existing Rotierst-Mattstetten line, similar to the first SBB rail proposal back in the 50s that called for a high-speed east-west line. Even though SBB is building high-speed sections first proposed in the 50s, high-speed rail is not on SBB's radar for the time being. We can't say for certain whether high-speed rail would be the next logical step if SBB completes all its projects to boost capacity capacity, speed, and integration. However, there's definitely a non-zero chance of high-speed rail. The network continues to expand, and SBB is already considering high-speed rolling stock for cross-border routes into countries with established high-speed lines. So it would make sense to maximize the use of that costly equipment wherever possible. But don't get too excited yet, because SBB's plan for the projects in the next 25 years makes no mention of increasing speeds beyond 200 km per hour, at which point there are still countless upgrades and initiatives that can be implemented to increase speed, capacity, and reliability without 300 km per hour top speeds. In conclusion, it seems very odd that a rail-crazy nation like Switzerland, with the technical know-how and proven experience constructing both high-speed rolling stock and rails, still doesn't operate high-speed rail. But like many great products around the world that prioritize speed above usability and economics, high-speed rail in Switzerland went the way of the Concorde, that cut transatlantic flight times from 8 hours to 3. Whilst the time savings are significant, operators of the aircraft couldn't make the financials work as people didn't see the value in paying a premium to arrive at their destination that much earlier. The same applies to high-speed rail in Switzerland. The national operator SBB, although having previously flirted with the idea of high-speed rail in plans decades before, they ultimately couldn't justify its cost. But different to the predominantly private businesses of air travel, SBB is a national operator that would be burning public funds for a vanity project in selected areas funded by a population who can and have used their democratic power to veto projects that don't benefit them. SBB's infrastructure strategy has to economically make sense, and of course politically. Otherwise, SBB could simply focus on its highly profitable routes along the Swiss plateau where most of the population resides and where least of the terrain obstacles are, whilst at the same time improving its service with regards to reliability, capacity, and certain level of speed. SBB chose the option of quiet achiever, focusing its resources across the whole network, making incremental upgrades with some large crucial infrastructure projects thrown in to support its important Taktfar plan that underpins the high usability of the network that has to operate with regard to the network's lowest common denominator, which in this case are the other non-high-speed local trains. Cramming a high-speed service in a network not designed for it can only cause problems and destabilize timetable. SBB's focus on having a strong base network created a strong buy-in from rural voters that reaped a benefit of strong connections to the fast trains crisscrossing the country, whilst also making sure that the listed 4-hour train trip is actually a 4-hour train trip. Germany serves as an example if you were to turn the tables around and build high-speed rail before the infrastructure can support it. So, in the future, we'll see many projects from SBB that increase the speed, reliability, and capacity of the network for the next quarter of a century, but none of those projects mention high-speed rail, except SBB teasing us by buying high-speed rolling stock anyway. But there's one final question I'm going to let you discuss amongst yourself. Is high-speed rail really that important that you'd want to pass landscapes like this faster?